Dear ladies and gentlemen, those of you who already watched my video channel probably watched a short video about what is democracy and whether we have democracy or not in this part of the world. Actually, I mean North America, but also Western Europe, Central Europe, not to mention the other parts of our planet. If you watched that video, you probably heard my opinion that we do not have democracy here. And that opinion of mine was supported by some more reliable sources. Actually, probably I'm a reliable source myself as well, in my capacity of the former professor of political science and history. But, of course, I refer to some better known and better respected sources, like Professor Sadaro, for example, not to mention Aristotle and Plato. All right, but if we do not have democracy, then what do we have? What is the system, what is the political system which dominates our societies, or whatever is left of them? Well, according to the old school of political science, represented by these guys, Aristotle and Plato, the Republic of Plato, and Politics by Aristotle. Those books were written way more than 2000 years ago, but they are still actual, and it's very hard to argue with them if needed. Those people, I mean Aristotle and Plato, used the word the rule of mob to denote our current political system, because our current political system is not new at all. Ancient Greece went through that several times. There is another term which is known as Ochlocracy, which means actually the same as the rule of mob. But the term of Ochlocracy was introduced by Polybius about 2000 plus years ago. You probably never heard of Polybius, but I'm not so sure that you need to know that name. It's probably less important than Aristotle and Plato. So what exactly is Ochlocracy? And what did Aristotle, Plato, and Polybius meant by the rule of mob? If you don't mind, I'll take a smoke, okay? You know what's really interesting? As of today, many people are insulted by someone smoking in their presence, even if they cannot feel the smoke. Well, of course, I respect their feelings and tender those feelings are. On the other hand, what's so bad about smoking? It would hardly be an exaggeration to say that my civilization, which is probably yours as well, was created by those people who are drinking alcohol, smoking, eating red meat, and by the way, taking no drugs. And maybe our civilization was ugly. Well, everything created by humans is ugly to this or that extent. But it was definitely not bad, because I would take the liberty of saying that it was our civilization who gave up slavery, who gave up racism, who gave up death penalty, and did it voluntarily, unlike many other civilizations and cultures. But I believe we are moving away from the main topic. The main topic is, what exactly is ochlocracy? According to Aristotle, Plato, and Polybius, ochlocracy is a transitional form that marks the end of democracy and signals the beginning of tyranny. Ochlocracy is usually pretty short-living. Of course, we know that mobs cannot run cities, countries, and societies in general. They are usually puppets in other people's hands. So, according to our ancient gurus, ochlocracy is a result of degradation of democracy, when democracy is becoming more and more liberal and finally turns into ochlocracy. Before we go any further, I would like to mention that there is a significant difference between the words demos and ochlos. Pretty often, if you go to Google Translator, for example, and if you enter the word demos in Greek, the translation you will receive will mean people. But that's not an exact translation, because in ancient Greece, during the era of Plato and Aristotle, by demos they meant free, independent, and responsible citizens who were allowed to vote. Not the whole population of ancient Greek city-states were allowed to vote, only those whom I've just mentioned. So from the point of view of Plato and Aristotle and Polybius and of those who followed them, in order to vote and choose the form of the authority that you are going to submit, you, first and foremost, you needed to be free, not a slave, or in our contemporary terms, independent. Then you needed to be smart, that's right, to be able to make decisions, to make your independent analysis. And of course, you need to have certain time to be able to go into the details of the politics, to find out who is who and what to expect from whom. And in addition to that, of course, responsibility is very important. While voting, you should be able to understand what to be the consequences for you and for those whom you love and respect. Speaking about the independence, well, you probably won't disagree with me that in order to be independent, you have to have certain level of wealth. If you're wealthy enough, you are more or less independent. You're not dependent on a job or on a boss, on his decision. You're probably a boss yourself. That makes you way more free. If you are dependent on your bosses or on, I don't know whom, of some people who probably can instruct your boss, then you're not 100% free. And so is your vote. It's not exactly your vote, because you are afraid to vote the way you think. This is one aspect. Then, speaking about smartness, well, the concept of smartness is of course very relative, but nevertheless, we respect all people, and I personally respect everyone around me, but some people are more capable of an independent analysis, others are less capable of independent analysis. And by the way, it is not dependent on their educational level. Some people with university degrees are unable to do that, whereas some working class people are pretty smart to understand who is who and what this or that person or party can offer them. Responsibility probably requires no comments. So anyway, there were certain restrictions in the democratic countries, in the city-states of ancient Greece, and in the European democracies. Up until the end of the First World War, in the absolute majority of more or less democratic countries, there was no such thing as a universal suffrage. Now, let me make an incredible statement, but before I make that statement, I would like to say that this is not my opinion. Not that I don't have an opinion, I probably do. But in order to express your own opinion, you need to live in a society that enjoys freedom of speech. We cannot boast freedom of speech in where we live, so let's forget about my opinion. What I'm going to say is a logical conclusion that was made by Plato, Aristotle, and their followers. So after disclaimer, let me tell you that according to them, who are way smarter than me, the universal suffrage is the end of democracy and the beginning of ochlocracy, or the rule of mob. What an incredible statement, isn't it? Well, it is. And again, someone would ask me, what are the criteria of the mob? Of course, by the mobsters in this sense, we do not mean criminals. We mean just irresponsible, dependent people. And again, someone could say, maybe you are, pointing at me, maybe you are a part of the mob. Well, maybe, because, for example, during the period that preceded the universal suffrage, to prove your responsibility, you were supposed to own a piece of real estate property, a house or a piece of land or something else similar to that. In that sense, for example, my humble self is not a reliable person because, like a typical Caucasian male over 50, I'm divorced, and as a result of divorce, I don't have real estate property. I left it to my ex. From that point of view, it wouldn't be illogical to say, okay, how can this guy be responsible if he doesn't have real estate here in our town or in our country? Tomorrow he can leave the country or leave this city, leave this town, and he's not going to take the consequences of this vote. And you know what? I like voting, but from my point of view, there is some logic behind that. Or, for example, if a person is on welfare, is that person dependent or independent? Is that person free? Well, again, let me not express my own opinion, but from the point of view of simple logic, maybe not. Also, if a person is not smart enough to get interest in politics, how can that person vote? He votes basing on some very simple and sometimes wrong criteria. Let me give you an example. A friend of mine asked his cleaning lady, "Hey, Sarah, did you vote?" She said, "Oh, yes, I voted." "And whom did you vote for?" She said, "Oh, I voted for Trudeau." "Why so?" asked my friend. And she said, "Well, he's such a handsome man." Well, this is a good example of ochlocracy, or an ochlocratic approach. That lovely lady doesn't know anything about Mr. Trudeau and his Liberal Party, what they are doing, what they are planning to do to people like her. But she's still trying to find a criterion, and yes, he is smart, and some other candidates look rather evil from her point of view. That's the criterion. Are those criteria right? Well, I don't think so. Also, if a person is poor and has to take 2 jobs and work hard, does that person have time and energy to look into the politics, to find out who is who, to find out what to expect from this or that party? Unfortunately, no. Well, again, I totally respect that kind of person, but that kind of person just doesn't have time and energy to go to the details and to vote smartly. As a result, what do we have all over the ex-democratic world? We have the power of people for whom the incompetent and irresponsible majority have voted. As a result of that, we are getting what we are getting. But what are we having now? Well, I believe it's clear that what we are having now is the power of mediocre personalities. Again, it wasn't me, I'm a very humble person, who invented that term. That was Gustave Le Bon. Have you heard that name? Probably some of you did, because when I was teaching poli-sci at the University of Victoria, the books of Gustave Le Bon were parts of the important reading. As of today, in many universities, for some reasons, the books of Gustave Le Bon, a political philosopher of the beginning of the 20th century, are usually recycled because the universities believe that Le Bon is not needed. However, it was Gustave Le Bon who was the first who used the term, the power of mediocre. And what's wrong about the power of mediocres? Again, not according to me, but according to Gustave Le Bon, the power of mediocres is pretty dangerous because mediocre personality will never let a talented person, a talented politician, a talented specialist, an outstanding personality to get close to power and close to the decision making. Not to mention that the mediocre personalities are usually incapable of ruling and running. So who is running the countries, the cities, and provinces, counties? Those who are standing behind the mediocre personalities. who are their puppet masters. And that is pretty bad as well for all of us, because finally that leads to the destruction of the society. Sorry, I'll take a smoke again. Now let me remind you of something I've said at the beginning of this video. According to the old guys, Aristotle and Plato, ochlocracy is a traditional form that is lying between democracy and tyranny. And actually, what are we watching nowadays? We are now watching probably the transition from ochlocracy to the tyranny, if we look at the US elections, for example, that were clearly taken away from the voters. And not only in the United States, there are countries like Russia, there are many other countries where those who are running them are openly cheating with the election results and clearly showing Oculus, or the crowd, that their votes do not mean anything. By the way, it's interesting, probably a year ago I was talking in the street to one young Canadian guy, and he was not going to vote, and I tried to encourage him to vote because he's a Canadian citizen, and he said a very interesting phrase, and many other young people think the same way, as I found out. Listen, if our vote had any meaning and could change anything, do you sincerely believe that they would have let us vote? No way. That's very interesting opinion, and that's a very sad opinion, because it clearly shows that even young guys like that know that we don't have democracy, don't believe in democracy, and don't believe in their capability of making the world better. Too bad, so sad. Okay, now let's switch to what could theoretically be done to somehow stop the transition from ochlocracy to the tyranny and maybe return democracy with its freedoms, with its human rights, etc., etc. Again, now, a disclaimer. Before I go any further, I would like to tell you, I'm not expressing my opinion in the sense whether it would be good or bad. It's not important in this context. Plus, it's dangerous in the absence of the freedom of speech. So I'm just offering several theoretical variants without asking you to support anything of that, without trying to encourage you to share this point of view, and without making such definitions as a good decision or bad decision, good variant or bad variant, especially keeping in mind that in our society, or whatever is left of our society, such criteria as good and bad are simply non-existent. Self-explanatory. Imagine if a politician would offer to get rid of the universal suffrage. That politician would be destroyed within hours. His career will be over, political career, and maybe he would even go to jail. Because if you give something to the people, you cannot easily take it away. Well, you can do that, but you can do it step by step, just like those mediocre rulers are taking away our freedoms. But you cannot do it just like that right away. However, there could be a very interesting variant. That variant would include a proposal to compensate some people for not voting if they are not sure whom to vote for. Like, for example, you addressed a citizen, we respect you, this is your irrevocable right to vote, but if you are not sure whom to vote for, you can probably refrain from voting, and for that you'll get a financial compensation. It could be $100, it could be $200, actually it could be $1,000. Just one-time financial injection. And you will be surprised how many people will go for such a proposal. Someone would say, okay, if in some country, like in the United States, for example, 10 million people would refrain from voting, and each of them has to be paid $1,000. Tons of money. Oh yes, yes, it's a significant sum of money. However, the damage created by such voters is way, way, way more devastating than a couple $1 billion spent on compensating them for them refraining from voting. That's one solution. Again, I'm not telling you to fight for that solution. I'm not going to say whether it's good or bad, but nevertheless. Another solution that sometimes is used, for example, in Latin America, is military coup. You stop ochlocracy, you stop elections for a certain amount of years, you establish dictatorship, and later, slowly but surely, the dictatorship could evolve in the direction of democracy, when certain people would be allowed to vote and others would not. Of course, many of you can say, oh, so terrible. Well, terrible it is, but maybe the consequences of ochlocracy are also terrible. We'll see that pretty soon. So actually, there are two variants of action in this situation. Of course, we also know that in the countries like the United States or West European countries, there are no such armies and there are no such generals that could go for a military coup. There are no Pinochets these days in our countries. By the way, I don't want to say that Pinochet was good. God forbid. No, 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 no. It's just a theoretical, philosophical talk. Very simple and very easy and non-binding. But anyway, if nothing happens, of course, if we believe Plato, Aristotle, and Le Bon, our beloved ochlocracy will pretty soon turn into the tyranny, where many people would lose what they had, and many of us will have to do things that we do not want to do. Actually, variant number 3 also exists. That variant is waiting for another 2,000–3,000 years. Well, of course, we won't see the consequences, but we probably know that everything in nature and in politics develops in circles. So, a couple more circles, of course, if our civilization survives. Maybe it won't. But it might survive or transform into something similar. And in that case, in 2–3,000 years, a real democracy may come again. And, well, although we won't see it, in terms of history, in terms of the cosmic space, 2–3,000 years is nothing. Unpleasant part of it is that probably most of us will have to live under the conditions of tyranny. As a person who lived under communist tyranny in my early years, I know how to survive under those conditions. And you will learn that too. You are smart, aren't you? In that connection, what I would like to say at the end, well, I'm really sorry. I didn't say anything positive, but there is some positive element here. We're still alive, we're still enjoying some of our freedoms, so let's enjoy them and try to live well as long as we can. And what happens later is probably beyond our control. But on the other hand, if we keep thinking independently, this will probably give us some weapon, I mean in the figurative sense, not firearms, but some weapon that could allow us to protect ourselves and those whom we love. Thank you very much for watching this video, and have a great rest of the day.